Happy Mother's Day, all you moms out there. So good. We want to celebrate you guys. And thank you for being here today and for joining us wherever you might be watching. My wife is watching now. Happy Mother's Day to you. And my mom is watching, and my mother-in-law. So happy Mother's Day to all of those of you who have been that influence for me in my life. I'm super grateful to be able to share this. And you kind of walked into a doozy. Normally, it's kind of like Easter, right? Normally, Mother's Day is like for carnations and nice, sweet things. And today we're going to talk about confusion in community and handing people over to Satan. Sounds like a great Mother's Day message, doesn't it? I told Julie, we were sitting by the backyard. I said, hey, tomorrow's message is about handing people over to Satan. She's like, on Mother's Day? I was like, I know, right? So I've tried to talk myself out of this about 15 times. So if it doesn't go well at the early service, I will abandon this, and the 11 and the 5 will look much different than this one. So we'll see how this goes. But we're beginning a series on relationships, and it's not about your dating relationships, your marriage relationships. It's about relationships in general. I think we have ended up with a network of acquaintances, relationships, if you will, that are largely undefined. And we all know that relationships, right, have this potential to bring us incredible joy and thrill, and our lives are richer for the relationships that we have, but also relationships can be sort of a pain, and not just a pain, but they can bring incredible pain into us. And we end up with this relational economy, this sort of way in which we relate to one another that has a set of expectations on it that are largely assumed and largely undefined. And if they are defined, it's usually quite restrictive. And it causes us a range of emotions, everything from sort of chronic annoyance, you're just annoyed with people all the time, to a crushing pressure that you just can't please all the people that you have relationships in. There are all kinds of expectations about how we are to communicate, how we're to spend time with one another. And depending on what season of life you're in, this all has different questions or different expectations on you. There are expectations about texting. There are expectations about Snapchat and leaving people unopened. There are expectations about response times, all sorts of things. Anybody got a friend who sends you a text message and the next text message they send you is, hey, or did you get my text message? And you're like, and you just want to come through the phone and like choke them. It's like, I'm busy, I've got stuff going on. You can't just interrupt me anytime. And you're just immediately annoyed with people. Or you get the great text message, all it says is, hey. Don't you love when people send you a text message that you have no idea how to send them a text message back? It's like a conversation that you should have, but they send it in a text message like you're gonna have this over texting. And so there's all these expectations, then you immediately feel pressure. Some of you go home and you see like your phone has got 150 unread text messages. You're on 14 group texts and everybody's just pinging back and forth with each other. When it comes to social media, when it comes to how, when we were growing up, I remember one of the big tensions was who got taken home first. We used to have a pile of people in a car. We'd all be out as friends. it was like who's going home first and who's going home last, or some kind of pecking order in how, whoever was driving and whichever friend you were in that range is who got dropped off when. And you were always kind of nervous about were you going to be the first friend or the last friend. There's expectations about when you hang out, when you don't hang out, who facilitates hangout time. There's expectations even about exclusivity, right? Are you the best friend? Are you BFFs? Are you like one of many? And this creates a level of protectiveness and possessiveness that makes relationships a lot of fun, right? What about people who like you more than you like them, or people who you like more than they like you, right? You know this kind of thing, right? They think you're best friends, but you're not best friends. Do y'all know this, right? So you're like, okay, we're tracking. This is particularly dicey as we move from one season of life into the other. When you were in college or high school, it was all hang out, and then you get a job and you can't be on your phone for 8 hours in a day, or at least you shouldn't be, because you should be working and getting, doing what you're paid to do instead of being on talking to all your friends. But there's this tension. You don't know how to go, so you end up longing for what used to be. You end up longing for the way things were. You have kids, and now your whole network of friends is around your kids' friends and their parents, and soccer and all the other things that go into that. So we have all this kind of chaos that goes into this. And so what I want us to do is I want us to define these relationships very clearly and really, I think, give some vision or set up some tension. Give some vision and then ask you 2 questions or leave you to wrestle with 2 questions. And that's how we're going to celebrate Mother's Day today. Because I think what happens to us is we get so bogged down, so fearful that we don't engage in relationships because we don't have the bandwidth. We just don't have any more bandwidth to be nice to anyone else. And what we end up doing is we end up pulling away from the relationships that matter. We end up more isolated and more alone. And this is just a recipe for disaster. And now we've got this sort of culture invading the next generation. So I want to define some relationships and relational connections and way in which you and I can exist. And I think this actually is one of the things that is most unique about the opportunity of the church. And as we learn to understand this and participate, I think it becomes far more than just about your personal development, your personal growth, but it actually becomes about you being able to enjoy the life in which God has placed you in. You cannot have these connections with everyone. Some of you are gonna need to draw some boundaries. Let me say that one more time. Some of you are gonna need to draw some boundaries. Some of you are gonna need to learn to respect other people's boundaries, right? We all agree with this? We're gonna have to learn how to do this and define some things about this. You cannot have these kinds of connections with everyone, but you should have them with someone, or else you're gonna end up isolated and alone. Your heart is gonna grow hardened and cold and all the things that happened with that. So here are my assumptions for our series as we begin our time today. Everyone more than likely has a relationship experience that restores your faith in people. You got one of those? Something that you've done that just kind of gives you a sense of, okay, I can enjoy. This is gonna bring a level of, breath and thrill to humanity and the people that are around us. I just love people more because of this relational experience. You kind of have a little bit of hope. You've had that happen? Maybe? Okay, well, maybe the next one's for you. I also assume everybody has had a relational experience that undermines your faith in people. You should never trust another human being again. You're just better off making hammocks in St. John. In fact, I've learned a new skill. I've been decorating cakes, and that may be my next adventure here, depending on how things go in the next few weeks, right? So happy Mother's Day to you. There is a reason, though, for this, and I think there's a connection for Mother's Day. I think moms probably live under perhaps more pressure than almost any other sort of occupation or job or call than anywhere else. Because you feel this pressure, especially in our culture where perhaps you just don't ever feel like you can do enough. There's so much competition, so many things that always sort of kind of create a standard by which you are expected to operate. And I think that a lot of moms end up living with this sort of low grade guilt that you don't do enough, or you can't do enough, or you can't measure up. Perhaps it's sort of a subtle guilt that you feel over a marriage that failed, and now you're a single mom and you're trying to figure out how to make ends meet and how to keep your kids and be mom and dad. Perhaps there's some other relational dynamics that aren't the way you want them to be, and so you feel this sense of that you got to do more or more is expected of you because of this. Maybe you blame yourself for what your kids either have done or are doing or what they haven't done. And you think, if I just did a little more, if I were just a different mom, if this were different, then perhaps. And so you hold on to this sense of regret, or you're just gonna work yourself even harder to try to do more for your kids because you couldn't protect them enough or provide enough or whatever it is that's in your sort of mind. And so what I wanna do on Mother's Day is we wanna celebrate you. We wanna celebrate you. It's an incredible call. But also I think what I'll hope we'll do sort of pastorally is that you will feel sort of someone sharing the load that you have. That you'll feel a body, a community of people who share that sense of responsibility, that those expectations that you hold onto. And so that's what I want for us to do, and why I think the way we define and understand relationships actually matter, because this is what we get to do for one another. I want us to explore the way that we've been called to live as human beings, as people who are created and intended, I believe, by God and for God. There's a work that He's been given, and we've been given to do by God Himself, by the Creator of the world. And I want for us to explore this and to test ourselves and our willingness to give ourselves for one another, and then we'll see what happens. So 1 Corinthians is a letter, and we're going to be looking at chapter 5. Now, one of the things that I do, and a lot of you are familiar with this, is, and I don't want you to think, oh, Mike is so smart or spiritual. So I print out books of the Bible. This is 1 Corinthians printed out entirely. I didn't do this last week. This is probably 3 years ago. And what I like to do is I like to be able to sit down, and I like to be able to lay it all out, because this is a letter, right? So this is chapter 4, and I have the number of the pages because oftentimes it ends up being all over the place. 6, 7, 8, 9. And you just sort of read this like a letter. And I usually set it on my desk and I just read it from left to right, and I look and I make notes, and it takes me sometimes years to go through it. I've gotten over, like I read the Bible in a year, several years in a row, because that was what you do. You read the Bible through in a year, which is it's a great exercise, by the way. But I had to learn to give myself grace that if it takes me a year to get through 1 Corinthians, that's okay. If it takes me 2 years to get through 1 Corinthians, that's okay, because it's more about what God is teaching me and what He's revealing to me than it is about me getting through and checking the boxes that I've read all the books of the Bible and know them backwards and forwards. So I say that because I want you to have some permission when you're reading the Bible, which I think you should do. There are some weird and hard things in the Bible, and this is one of those sections that's really hard. In fact, the passage you're looking at begins with a sex scandal. There you go. Mother's Day. It's like, why am I doing this? And it's taken me a long time to begin to see this, because these letters that Paul wrote to these churches, we use them like hammers to highlight issues. And there's no question this addresses some issues, and so does 1 Corinthians. It talks a lot about our bodies and the possession of our bodies and being able to understand our desires and all the things that go in there. There's a big part of this. But I think it's so unbelievably important in terms of how we look at this, because it begins and it talks about the sense of people are dividing themselves along which leader they like better. I like this preacher better. I like that preacher better. I like the way this church does this better. I like the way that church. And he's like, that's baloney. We don't have time for that. That's how he starts this letter off. Sounds somewhat like today. There's a whole group of people who don't care anything about it. There's a whole group of people who are trying to say that their person who's teaching them this is better than every other teacher. And so then he basically goes through and talks about that. And then there's obviously a lot of things that are going on when they gather. They're manipulating each other. They're jockeying for position. And he's like, you guys are becoming arrogant. You're becoming proud. And then he said, it's actually reported among you that there's like this massive sexual scandal that is so unbelievable. And you guys are cool with it. You're not even bothered by it anymore. That's how he's talking about this. And I don't want to get into the details because I just don't. But so you don't tolerate this, and this person is harming the reputation, but not only harming the reputation, he's harming the work. And he suggests even that they should be put out of the fellowship. And you're like, whoa. So we start getting a checklist to go, well, if you've done this, you're out. We're going to excommunicate you. And there are actually traditions and religions that do this to people. I don't think that's the point of this passage. That's why I want to read it, because if you're reading this in your quiet time, you're going to start thinking about either you deserve to be excommunicated, or you're going to think about people that you know who deserve to be excommunicated. And I don't think that's the point. I think there's something else going on when he's talking about the body. And I'm going to give you a list of this in just a minute, but I want to read this to you because here's where I think it gets down. He says that there's this idea, and he basically says, you're going to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of their flesh, but for the salvation of their soul. I'm going to do a little teaching on this later on, probably on video, and we'll put that out. But here's what I want us to see. He says, your boasting is not good. When we just finished this series on perfection, we talk about the fact that boasting is this thing that where we place our confidence. This is what we put our stock in. He says you're boasting in this whole, your way of doing, tending to this with indifference is not good. Do you not know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Do you not know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? He's talking about this festival, this Passover feast that the Jewish Christians, followers of Jesus, would have been familiar with. The Exodus from Egypt, the Passover, they left in such a hurry that they didn't take any of the leaven that would allow the bread to rise. They ate flat bread. There's a lot in there. But he's using this imagery. Don't you know that a little bit of yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? We bought a KitchenAid, I told you that, one of those stand-up mixers, and when you're making bread or dough, you put a little bit of yeast in it. Before you know it, the whole thing is affected by it. That's what he's saying. It's really cool. It just gets swirled around. Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch as you really are. So that you may become who you actually are. This is what you need to hear. Some of you are so racked by guilt. You've trusted Christ. You're trying to walk with God, but you're so ashamed of what you've done. You're so ashamed of what has happened. You feel that he says, no, you've got to become who you are. So there's some things that you need to begin to pull apart or move aside so that you become who you are. For Christ, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. In other words, there's a sufficient sacrifice that's been made to live as one who is forgiven in this place where we are forgiven. For Christ has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival. I don't have time to get into that, but it's like, you can continue in this, but here's what he says. But not with the unleavened bread, the old bread leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So this is the foundation upon which we are going to build our time together. The reason this passage matters to me and the reason I think this is important is because I think there's a lot of confusion in our culture, and this sense of confusion is constantly being exploited and exasperated. We just continue to market confusion, and we're allowing the way in which people are confused to influence the way we tolerate one another, the way we accept one another, and this creates a fragile foundation for relationships. I want to see if I can draw this out. This is sort of the first tension. And when I thought about this series, this is a new rule or a different rule for the way that we relate. To learn how to relate to one another in the kingdom. We're going to learn that over the next few weeks. But today I want to sort of establish the tension of what it means to live under this rule of law, this economy of exchange that we've talked so much about. But what happens in this tension is the foundation is basically on proof. You've got to always be demonstrated how someone else values you. You're always looking, do you value me? Did you text me back? Did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do enough that satisfies this thing that I'm looking for? Remember, this is pursuing our righteousness before men. In this model, what happens is the highest value of these relationships is acceptance. Now, I want you to hear me very clearly. Is acceptance a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing. Part of the thing that I love about Port City Church, and we hear this all the time, When you walk into any of our rooms, people will say, oh my gosh, and you're gonna hear it in baptism stories, people will say, I didn't feel condemned, I didn't feel judged, I didn't feel any of these things. I felt accepted. That's exactly right. That is not the highest value that we have for you, for one another. But in these relationships, it seems acceptance becomes the highest value, and then the operating principle is simply affirmation, and you just run around and affirm one another all the time. And we live in this chronic affirmation culture that's basically yep, even if it conflicts or even if it harms or even if it's not healthy. And the reason is because anything that you do that doesn't affirm who you already are feels like a rejection, and we can't tolerate it. So this is the tension in which we live, and this is what's being exploited in our culture, and it's particularly harmful for the next generation. It's particularly harmful for those who, when I was younger, when I was a younger man, when I was younger, it started happening when you were about 16, 17, 18, and 19. Now it happens when the next generation is 10, 11, and 12. And their souls and their hearts cannot withstand the pressure. They will not withstand the pressure. There's something that's breaking. And I think we have an opportunity to do something about this. Part of what makes this section to me so powerful is the way we think about this. And again, I wrestled with not doing this, but the fact that the issues that are in these chapters, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are so pertinent today. They're bubbling to the surface the same way they are today. And they have to do with sort of a runaway sexualization of everything. It's a confusion around masculinity and femininity and the resulting chaos in our culture. And this is what's happening. You see this is in the news everywhere. And we are pushed away from one another, leaving us to struggle alone, or perhaps even worse, we struggle in chronically unstable and unhealthy relationships. There's nothing that helps us because it's all affirmation based. It's just accept, affirm, and nothing ever gets shaped or formed the way it ought to. And so what happens is, especially for our students, as they pursue answers in isolation, confusion begins to ask questions, and we pursue answers in isolation, giving rise to YouTube and Google as the main mentors of an entire generation. And the hypersexualization of everything only adds to the confusion. Then you add the 24/7 reality shows that we live in on Instagram and TikTok. We've created a vacuum that sucks everything away from everything else. And this is the exact opposite of what God longs to do in our culture. This is what's happening. When people find something confusing, if you're a student, a high school student, a middle school student, when you find something confusing, it often feels like something to be ashamed of. Even as an adult, it feels like something to be ashamed of. And so we look to find affirmation, someone who will affirm us in our confusion, and we end up looking for affirmation and not answers. And this is a cycle that will harm your soul and will steal your purpose. I think we have an increasing generation gap that is marred by distrust and misunderstanding and even accusations of one generation to the next. I think this is why it's so important to understand this rule of life, this way of life under the rule of God's love, to understand the kingdom of God and to understand what Jesus means when he calls himself our King and our allegiance to him. I said this last week, and I want to remind you of this, that God is not at work in our country to solve our national problems. But what he is doing is he is calling a people to himself to demonstrate his love to the world as we give our lives in allegiance to him. That's what he's doing. And the way in which we relate to one another is a critical part of that. What I think is powerful is the hope for the way in which we enjoy one another and the world in which we have been entrusted with is to build the kind of relationships for which we have been called to, and in fact, the kind we have been created for. They're defined by words like koinonia, fellowship, shared experiences and intimacy with one another, companionship and community. This is what we are for. This is what we are working for in all things. And this affects all of us. For we have an entire generation that is languishing in isolation and confusion, marked by anxiety and fear, hidden behind this profile-driven culture of personal branding. We have another generation who's sort of given up or abdicated our responsibility, or we just live with this chronic sense of guilt for what we have done. I think if you look closer, there's a real reason for hope. And so this is what I want for us to experience together. So here's my list of things from 1 Corinthians chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 that I think are observations. Here they are. Number one, observation number one. The main point of this passage isn't kicking people out, it's becoming a distinct people. It's that you and I together need to mark, need to represent the image of God, to be distinctly different from the world in which we live, which is actually getting easier and easier, by the way. If you're just remotely kind, you're different than most people. If you don't flip people off in traffic, you're different than most people. This is not hard. The bar is not that high. Did I say that? I gotta be careful. I can tell you when I get old, I'm gonna be fun because my brain's already doing it. Number two is the progressive nature of sin to undermine and divide. And this is what I want for you to pay attention to, because a lot of you think that you're bad and your shame is killing you. And what you need to understand is this is what sin always does. It is progressive. A little bit of leaven begins to affect the whole thing. You allow anything into your thought life, anything into your view, it affects who you become. It affects who you become. Endless scrolls on TikTok affect you. They're not without a little bit of leaven begins to affect everything else. The music you listen to, the TV you watch, all the things that you do begin to affect you. The people that you hang out, all these things affect us. A little bit of leaven affects everything, and sin always works to undermine and to divide. The third thing that I noticed in this passage is how seriously we should take our calling as Christ's body. The church is not just a place for us to retreat to feel better about ourselves on Sunday, especially Mother's Day, but rather it's actually the force through which the world experiences God's intention for redemption. It is the force in this world through which the world gets to experience God's redemption that is his intention. Number four is the essential role of personal relationships in our own sense of calling. So that's where I want for us to spend the last 9 minutes and 27 seconds together. And I gotta figure out how to get through all this. So there's a tension when it comes to living as God's people, distinct. There's the tension of mission to reach people and help them walk with God, to advance into the culture. And there's a tension to say that the culture is so messed up, we gotta retreat from it and create little pockets for ourselves. And when I wrote this is that our mission, the mission to reach people and help them walk with God, allows us to advance, and we end up sacrificing community. This has been my own personal struggle. I'm very forward, I think forward, and I've ended up probably sacrificing relationships along the way. I have great relationships, great friendships, great community, but there are places where I could have done better because I was so focused on what was ahead. But there's a tension that the mission allows us to advance into the culture, but we end up sacrificing some of those connections, or community allows us to retreat and we end up sacrificing the mission. We just need to be content with the people who think like us and look like us and believe like us, and we can just huddle up and be this holy huddle and let the whole world go to you know where. Hand it over to Satan, right? That's what the Bible says. That's sarcasm, by the way. We want to be a formative community. We want for what happens in the relationships that we experience to shape us, and that's what I want for us to do. Now, let me be really clear here. You're made to bear God's image, and we need one another in order for that to happen. And this is what creates the tension that we have to look at and try to lean into today. Otherwise, what you end up with is just a network of BFFs who basically affirm everything that you are already doing, which isn't bad, it's just insufficient. And what I want to make also clear is what I'm not trying to do is I don't want to make you feel bad for not trusting people who are not trustworthy. This is kind of a disclaimer because some of you live in places where there's been abusive relationships or there's been at least codependency or chronic unhealth, and you're fighting those battles. So I want to make it very clear that those of you who are trapped in codependent or abusive relationships, we need to have a different set of operating principles. And what we're going to talk about is a mutual building up, not people being projects. And so what I'm trying to do is I want to give you permission to draw boundaries where boundaries are needed, but also to avail yourself, because that may be more the problem, to avail yourself where you need to for healing and formation and for growth and redemption, to define relationships, to define what it means to live in community. We did a series called Together at the beginning of the year. We defined community this way. The community is the relational space through which God's love is exchanged, experienced, and ultimately expressed. That's what our relational space as followers of Jesus, that's what we are constantly doing. We are constantly doing. And one more thing is you don't live in one system or the other. We often vacillate back and forth between them. You'll be really walking in a way where you're experiencing and exchanging God's love with someone. The next moment you're taking from them and demanding they do something. Well, this is why we have to walk and learn from one another. We're going to talk more about this over the coming weeks. But there's a call for us to encourage one another. I just went through and made a list. There's also the courage to challenge one another. Do you have people who encourage you and people who challenge you? There's a call to shoulder burdens, to shoulder one another's burdens. We talked about this last week. There's also the courage to share them with other people. There's the call to offer ourselves and also the courage to receive from other people. There's the call to give grace and also the courage to tell the truth. There's the call not to offend one another. There's also the courage not to be offended. All of these go together. So this series is going to serve to help us discern and try to understand how we can relate to one another and the implications of this hinge point of life with God together for the world. So community requires this mutual building, this giving of ourselves. I'm going to give you two passages here. I'm going to ask you two questions, and then we'll be done. Romans 14, this is all throughout. I mean, it's back in 1 Corinthians. It's all throughout Paul's writing. And he says this in chapter 14. He says, let us make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. This is the standard by which you and I begin to learn how to relate to one another. It's to pursue, make every effort to pursue peace and mutual edification. It means you have to have vision for the people around you. To have vision for the people around you, have vision for your friends, have vision for your marriage, have vision for your kids. Mutual requires shared responsibility. This isn't one person carrying those, this is mutual. In these kind of relationships, we forgo blaming one another, making excuses for one another. Instead, we're gonna take responsibility, mutual shared responsibility for what's happening in the lives of those people around us. You can't do this for everyone, but you need to be this for someone. Edification requires us to change and grow. The reason that acceptance isn't the highest value for us as a church is because we believe you are being formed into the image of Jesus Christ for the sake of his purposes in the world. And to simply accept you where you are is to be unloving to one another. We accept, we hold on, we believe about one another. But man, we know that God is doing things and we want to embrace all that God is doing. We're going to talk more about this. In community, there's a formative fellowship. There's obligations to one another. There are things that are required of us for each other, and it's mutual. You're not gonna change without pain or discomfort or being stretched and shaped. Lord knows it's happened to me. But this is both for the formation of our character and also for the healing of your past. You will never become stronger without some struggle, and you will never struggle well alone. Romans 15 says it like this: we who are strong, and you can just put yourself in whichever category you want, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. But each of us should please our neighbor for their own good and to build them up. And so the way I've defined relationships is this: relationships are the way in which we see ourselves as connected to one another. So what we're gonna look at, we're gonna define relationships this way. They're the way in which we see ourselves as connected to one another. How do you see yourself as connected to those around you? what we need is this relational space, these trusted connections that become community. Trusted, formative connections that lead to this place where God's love is exchanged and experienced. Now here's the tension. All of us want to become the way that we want to be. And so what we do is we don't want to present ourselves to the world until we become this person, right? So we hide, we withhold, we sort of work on ourselves, and then we'll present this to the world. The problem is that you need other people in order to become, right, who you're going to be, which works against itself. The thing that you need in order to become is to give yourself, to share yourself, to avail yourself to another person. And the thing that you want to withhold is to hold on to all those things until you become that person. Does that make sense? This is the tension. This is why I think the church, why these relationships actually matter. We have to present ourselves in order to become who it is that we are made to become. The way I wrote this, we have to share ourselves in order to become more ourselves. And that's the tension. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to do an assessment of your own connections. And for some of you, this is maybe difficult. But I want you to do an assessment of where you are, the formative relationships, the formative connections that you have. And I want for you to ask yourself these two questions. Question number one is, what is it about these connections that free you to share more of yourself? Are there relationships that you have that make you want to give more of yourself, or do they cause you to pull away and hide more of yourself, to conceal more of yourself? Test yourself. Question number two is, what is it about these connections that form you or shape you to become more of yourselves? There are relationships that I have that I'm insanely grateful for because they pushed me, they shaped me, they've formed me. They're rooted. And what is beginning to happen in them, and it's a process, right? Just like this was years and years and years, so are these kind of relationships. The thing that I'm grateful for that God has done is He's allowed me to be in one place for a very long period of time. Because you learn people, you see people, you know people know you. And to live in these relationships, these formative, shaping relationships. This is what we are to be for one another. And these relationships rest, make no mistake about it, not on how much you have together, how much you've accomplished, how good you already are, how insightful you are, what your Enneagram is. They don't rest on anything else. They rest 100%. If you're going to experience this kind of relationship, it rests 100% on you being able to receive and trust God's love for you. The beauty of the church, like the world is going to tell you, hey, look, this is the highest value just like you are, which is not nearly God's vision for you, His love for you, His call for you, the work that He has for us. And it's going to require you to give yourself to another person. The beauty of this is this isn't just about your own personal formation. This is about you actually experiencing, enjoying the life in which you have been entrusted. But it doesn't happen unless we do it together, and it begins when we learn how to receive and trust and walk in the love that God has for us, and then learn to exchange, to offer, to avail that to other people. That's where we're gonna go in the next couple of weeks. So happy Mother's Day to you, okay? I wanna pray for us, and then we're gonna close just declaring that truth together. Father, I thank you that you've made a way for us to relate to one another that is not the way the world tends to do this. Father, I do pray for the moms and dads and all of us who are responsible or have obligations to a generation behind us. They would not shy away, that we would not be defeated, but rather we would feel and sense empowered that you have created a people to shoulder that burden so that our children's children, that generations to come will know the God that we love and serve. So God, we believe in that, we rest in that. We're gonna build our lives on that. God, I pray that you would surround us with the people that we need in our lives and perfectly placed to do and to be what we need, what you long for in those moments, in those seasons. So Father, I just ask you to speak to us, to encourage us in these moments, to build our lives on the foundation that is unshakable. And I lift all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Won't you stand up as we declare this together?